Now, my name is Paul Brandt, and I think one of the things I hate the most in life is a celebrity on a soapbox. And so, as I started to tour and travel, and I met my wife Liz, I asked her if she would come on the road and sing in my band, and we started traveling. We were doing about 180 shows a year, traveling all over the world, and she would sing with me. Some days we would hit 5 cities in one day. I mean, we were just traveling everywhere. And she loves crime drama. We were watching this documentary on Dateline, Dateline NBC, and it was called Children for Sale. You can still see it online. And at that time, this was probably 18 years ago, the issue of child sexual exploitation and human trafficking really wasn't on the radar internationally. And so we watched it, and like a lot of other things that we see in life, difficult things, if it doesn't impact us, then often we don't really pay attention to it. And for Liz and I, we saw it, and it was horrible, but then we went on with our lives. And about 2 weeks after that, a humanitarian aid organization approached me and said that they'd like me to go on a trip where maybe I would consider becoming a donor. They worked in 90 countries around the world, and they said that Liz and I could pick whatever country we wanted to go to. And so we decided to pick the country that had been spotlighted in that NBC special, which was Cambodia. And we weren't prepared for what we saw there, and we were introduced to a group that was intervening on behalf of child trafficking victims. And we weren't prepared for what we saw. They would pay the rate that someone would have paid to take a child and to use them sexually for the day. And instead they would take them to a safe location and just let them be kids. They would let them play with toys and make sure they were fed, make sure they were clothed. And at that time, under Cambodian law, this law has changed now, these children were actually seen as being owned by the trafficker, owned by the brothel owner. And so at the end of the day, this organization had to take them back. That was shocking. It was soul-crushing, I think, for anyone, any good-willed person to see that, to know that these children would have to now endure such horrible abuses just because of the law and the way that it saw these children. It became personal. Human trafficking made a dent in my life and in my wife's life in a very different way than it would for a trafficking victim or survivor. But we determined to start to use our platform to try and raise awareness and educate people, help them to understand, and for us to learn more about the issue. So as she was recovering, I was still touring quite a bit. I decided to go back to Cambodia. And I think it's really important to say that, in this work that we're doing with Not in My City, human trafficking doesn't only have one look. It has many looks in many different locations. And one of the things we've heard even from frontline investigators that we work with is that there are certain recipes for approaching human trafficking in different areas, not only across Canada or through North America, but around the world. It looks different, but there's always a commonality, and that commonality is vulnerability. It's progressive in nature. It often starts at a very, very young age, and then it progresses. And so the general story is early childhood trauma, average age of being trafficked at 12 to 13 years old, younger for Indigenous populations. And then the number of years that someone is trafficked is often 7 years on average. And then society sees this once 12-year-old, now 19-year-old as someone who chose it. I went back to Cambodia, one of the darkest areas that I've ever seen. There was a lot of organized crime in the area that we were in. Actually, former MP Joyce Smith's law to extradite human trafficking perpetrators overseas and bring them back to try them in Canada. One of the first cases, I believe it was the first case of extradition, was in this area. It was the Baker file. And there was a California-based businessman in that location that was building a 3-story sex destination hotel to exploit the youngest of children, to bring in busloads and plane loads of men from around the world to exploit children. And it was very well organized. On one side of the street, there was a warehouse where children were drugged, and they were forced to sleep during the day. At night, they were given amphetamines and taken off to work in the local brothels. Children who had lost their lives to this trade were being buried under the construction project. And that was my moment. And I think everybody has an aha moment or an awakening moment when it comes to human trafficking. It had already had an impact on us, but this was the moment where I realized that with knowledge comes responsibility. And if we decide to turn a blind eye to it, the problem won't go away. It'll just continue. And we all have different capacities to affect change when it comes to the issue of human trafficking. We all have a very unique part to play, and it requires all of us pulling on that rope at the same time to actually make an impact. And I met a little girl on that street who has really become, I would say, in my mind's eye, the real impetus for the work that I do with Not in My City. She was 5 years old, and she was being sold 6 to 8 times a night to adult men. Well, and I thought about my kids, you know. I thought about my son, and I thought about, as his father, what am I going to teach him about how to be respectful and how to interact with women, how to be a generative masculine force in this world? And my daughter, who's 13, the average age that girls are trafficked in Canada. Someday she's going to ask me, Daddy, what did you do? What did you do when you met that little girl? I want to give her a good answer. So we just kept leaning in. And the wonderful thing about the cowboy hat is it gets you in a lot of doors. And I started to meet politicians. I started to meet lawmakers, change makers, legislators, thought leaders in Canada. And I was asked to speak at the first symposium on human trafficking that the RCMP hosted in Ottawa. And not many people knew about this crime at that time, and so I was considered an expert even though I didn't know anything about it. I was learning as I went. And I just kept moving forward. So it was 7 years ago. I was in between albums, still touring and traveling, and I love playing music for people. And I went back to my alma mater at Mount Royal University, and me and a colleague went to the business and marketing school there, and we spoke with the dean and the faculty. He said, what if I came in and told stories? I love telling stories. You know, I think stories are so powerful. And I would tell the students about getting a song recorded by Johnny Cash, or making it into the Canadian Country Music Hall of Fame, or traveling around the world doing music, or some of the philanthropic endeavors that we have experienced over the years. And they loved the idea. And what we asked the students to do is build businesses or social enterprise projects based on our stories. And so they gave me the least academic title ever bestowed on a person. They called me the storyteller in residence, which was great. And I loved it. And the students started to know me better than I knew myself. They knew how I was going to answer the question. And I told them about trafficking in Canada. I told them about how the average age is 12 to 13 years old, and traffickers are making $280,800 per year per victim in our country. I told them about the victims and survivors that I've met that were as young as that girl that I met in Cambodia, right here in Canada. And they were blown away. They had no idea. It wasn't on their radar at all. And so they said, well, why don't we do something? And this is the thing that I want to root people in our work. It's rooted in hope. We can do something about this. It seems overwhelming. It's hard to talk about. But when we embrace it and push forward, there is hope. We actually can make an impact. And so they came up with an idea, and we partnered with a fashion designer, Paul Hardy, to come up with our yellow rose. And they said, you know, most people when confronted with the issue of human trafficking, they say it doesn't happen here. They say not in my city. But once they learn about it, they determine that it will not happen in their city, not in my city. So we loved the double entendre, and we moved forward with that. A partner gave us the ability to create great visibility in Calgary and to start to let the public know about it. It was featured on the news, and we started to raise funds, and a movement was born. That was 7 years ago, and at that time in Alberta, we were told by some top law enforcement, good-willed law enforcement, that they believed that human trafficking didn't happen in Alberta. And their colleagues in other jurisdictions were saying it was so prevalent that they needed more resources. So we noticed a gap, and we started to raise awareness, education. We started to seek gaps and try to find ways to create more of a systemic approach to the issue of human trafficking. And since then, since the inception of Not in My City, I was asked to chair the Alberta Human Trafficking Task Force, where we listened to, again, it was about 100 presenters over a period of 20 months, and they, survivors, frontline investigators, police. We had people from healthcare of all different sectors talk to us about what they knew about human trafficking, and we wrote a report called the Reading Stone Report. And the idea was to look at the issue of trafficking through the lens of a survivor, and to make sure that the approach in Alberta and the recommendations that went forward would really demand that everything that we do to suppress and address human trafficking in Alberta was seen through that lens. And in Alberta, in 5 years, we went from human trafficking doesn't happen here to the acceptance of these recommendations, including now the formation of the new Alberta Office to Combat Trafficking, and a $22.8 million put forward. So it revealed that there were things that were not being seen the way that they needed to be. I think that it's important to say that there are still huge gaps when it comes to data and understanding the true picture of human trafficking, and I think anybody in the sector would agree. There's much more work that needs to be done, and it's due to the hidden nature of the crime and the lack of understanding. In his recent findings in the Ontario Supreme Court case related to the PSEPA, or Bill C-36, Judge Goldstein laid out in very great detail how the way that the public and the way that even people within this sector see the laws in Canada is often misinterpreted. The spirit of the law in Canada, in essence, was built on this concept that people who find themselves in a position to be selling sex are seen through the eyes of the law and by Canada as people who are in need of help and support. And that's a very important point. Often people misinterpret it to say that selling sex is legal in Canada, but that's actually a misinterpretation of the spirit of the law. What it really is detailing is that people who find themselves in the position to sell sex are held immune in the eyes of the law. And it's a very important distinction to make. And one of the best things about this model, some people call it the Nordic Model, other people call it the equality model, is that it states, and it's based on the premise that, and I'll use a word that's controversial, but it's based on the premise out of Sweden that prostitution, by its very nature, is discriminatory against people. You can't have an equal or egalitarian society where people can be bought and sold. And that stretches the gamut from sex trafficking to labor trafficking to organ trafficking and all of the many different types of trafficking that exist. So I'm so excited to be Canadian. I love the fact that I get to live in a country where we are using the world-class best-in-practice law, and it's been evidenced time and time again in other jurisdictions around the world, where the normalization of the sex industry, where full decriminalization and just the broad opening up of the sex industry has always resulted in a rapid inflow in human trafficking. And right now in Canada, we have the best of the best. There's never a perfect situation, but this is the best that it can be. And when we lean into this and we help to create a unified response across the country and how we're going to keep people who are impacted by this crime at the center of what we do, well, we can change so much.